Hello and welcome to episode 26 of the Monday Night Review. After last week, I felt like we needed something a little bit more relaxed, less stressful, less full on. So I've got something I was going to say a bit more frivolous, but I'm not sure he would see it that way. But I do feel like we needed a bit of TLC after the last episode on the bedsit murders. So a good old historical romp with a great British historical anti-hero. But I think it might be a bubble burster for some, because today we're going to talk about Dick Turpin. Born Richard Turpin, obviously, the fifth of six children to John Turpin and Mary Elizabeth Parmenter at the Bluebell Inn, which would later become the Rose and Crown, in Hampstead in Essex. He was baptised on the 21st of September 1705, so he was probably born early September or August. Children used to get baptised fairly young at the time. So John Turpin was a butcher and an innkeeper, hence why his children were born at the Bluebell Inn. And some stories suggest that Dick Turpin may have followed his father into these trades. In fact, at some point he does refer to himself as a butcher. So we think as a teenager he was apprenticed to a butcher in the village of Whitechapel. Note, village. While another source says that he ran his own butcher's shop in Thaxted. We know from his trial in 1739 that he probably had a rudimentary education, and though no records survive to this date, he did marry a lady called Elizabeth Millington in 1725. Following his apprenticeship, they moved north to Buckhurst Hill in Essex, where he opened his own butcher's shop. So all was fine up until this point. But at some point in the 1730s, in my notes I've put 1930s, which would be extraordinary. At some point in the 1730s, Turpin became involved in the Essex Gang. So this is a gang of deer thieves in the Royal Forest of Waltham. So the Royal Forest means that all deer in the forest belong to the Crown. So it was a big deal to thieve the deer, and having a butcher in your gang is probably no bad thing. The Black Act of 1723 was an attempt to crack down on poaching and deer thieves in general, and it gets its name from the blackening of the faces that the poachers used to do to hide in the forest at night. So in 1937, this act was expanded to change the penalty for deer stealing from a domestic offence that would be dealt with by the local Justice of the Peace, the JP, to more severe consequences, even transportation to what was then called the 13 colonies for a minimum of 7 years. In the 1730s, which I just aside, I always think transportation sounds horrendous, although I'm sure for some arriving in Australia from an English climate would be lovely. I think lots of people didn't even survive the journey. So the thought, I'm not good with boats anyway, but the thought of a boat when you're in trouble in the 1700s is just a no for me. So in the 1730s, a reward of about £10, which is about £1,220 today, was offered to anyone who could help identify the deer thieves, and a pardon was offered to any thieves who turned their buddies in. This reward was increased to £50, so about $7,900 in today's money, when people started being threatened by the thieves, and it was thought that £10 wasn't enough. So the Essex gang was quite a well-known gang of thugs, basically, with run by three brothers. And Turpin was seen at some of their things and not at others. He was never a fully fledged. It was basically that the three brothers were in charge. They were the ones that people knew about, and sometimes Turpin was present, sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes it was thought that maybe he was just there to help them get rid of the deer. And then when the reward was offered, they would go around and sort of threaten and beat up anyone who they thought might turn them in for the reward, which is why they upped it. So the Essex gang, which is sometimes called the Gregory gang because the three brothers' surname was Gregory, they would have needed someone to help shift the deer, and a young butcher would have been just the thing. Though by 1733, he was no longer a butcher. He was the landlord of the Rose and Crown pub at Clay Hill. Again, this could have been encouraged by the gang so that they have this whole building where they can hide the corpses of the deer and have a safe place that they can meet. By 1734, some of the gang had been captured, some had moved away, so they gave up deer stealing and started just stealing instead. Less niche, more violent. They raided several homes in the Woodford area, and we don't know how much of these Turpin was involved in, but he was definitely involved in the 19th of December when he and 5 other men raided the home of Ambrose Skinner, a 73-year-old farmer from Barking, and they left with an estimated £300. By 1975, the robberies had become much more violent. The gang wore masks and were armed with pistols. And on the 11th of February, some of the members were captured, imprisoned, and soon gave up the descriptions of the other gang members still to be caught. One of the tales of them, it basically seems that the violence has become almost more fun than the robbing. They were rumoured to have really tortured one man and raped his maid. One of the brothers raped the maid upstairs, whilst the others tortured the man and only ended up getting away with about £30. And it was after this that some of them were caught, and they gave up the descriptions of the remaining members. So Turpin was described as Richard Turpin, a butcher by trade, is a tall, fresh-coloured man, very much marked with smallpox, about 26 years of age, about 5 feet 9 inches high, living some time ago in Whitechapel, and did lately lodge somewhere about Millbank, Westminster, and wears a blue-grey coat and a natural wig. Doesn't sound quite the sort of dashing man we see in illustrated tales. The remaining members of the gangs briefly scatter, but there are a few more robberies in the Woodford area, and those in prison are eventually hanged at Tyburn on the 10th of March, and their bodies are hung on gibbets on Edgware Road. This was done at the time to put anyone off doing similar crimes, but also to show the members of the gang that they are looking for what is going to happen to them when they get caught. I guess as a sort of, don't do it anymore, because the more you do it, the more likely you are to get caught. Jasper Gregory, who's one of the leaders, was captured and hanged in late March, and his brothers suffered the same fate in April. So all 3 of the leaders are hanged. Their fence, Mary Brazier, is deported. She's sent to the 13 colonies, and eventually, so the fence is the woman who is going to shift the stolen goods for them. Basically, she is caught and deported, and eventually only Turpin's left. So what does one man remaining from a whole gang of robbers do in the 1730s? Well, he becomes a highwayman, apparently. So the first instances of the use of the word highwayman is recorded in around 1615, but other terms have been used, such as gentlemen of the road or knights of the road, which is an effort to romanticise what's often a really violent form of mugging. What differentiated them from footpads was that they were on horses, which made it easier for them to catch people and easier for them to make a quicker escape. And also makes it more of an unfair fight. If someone's on a heavy animal and they're above you, they're much more likely to be sort of fear-inducing than if you think you can go toe-to-toe with a footpad, perhaps, if you're a fighty sort of person. So the great era for highwaymen is around from about 1660 to 1714. Some of them are soldiers that have returned from the English Civil War and the wars in France, and they just can't find any way of getting work. So I mean, much like we see today, quite often if you have been in the army and you have fought in wars and you've seen terrible things, you're not necessarily equipped for work either physically, mentally, or in terms of training for a normal job. So there's nothing for them to do. So quite often it was ex-soldiers. So some highwaymen just flat out rob people, while others form a sort of early British mafia, where they get the drivers who use the route regularly to pay them to pass through without being robbed, and they sort of protect that area, that stretch of road. At the same time, policing's really local and frankly fairly crap, especially in the rural areas, which means that towns will have their own police presence, which is usually just one person. Cities, it's obviously a bigger deal, but there was no link between them. And the areas between towns and villages were sort of unpoliced. So it made it very easy for robbers to work on these roads. The highwaymen did actually use the term stand and deliver, and stagecoaches and postboys were often targets as they're unprotected, and would yield good stuff. If you held up a stagecoach, you're probably going to have a lot of people comparatively, and therefore more swag, and stealing a bag of post would probably get you some good stuff. So yes, tobacco and other goods could be worth just as much to highwaymen if they had some way of laundering the goods. So if they had a fence like Mary Brazier was for the gang, then they could make money from basically whatever they took. It's quite often why pubs like Jamaica Inn are linked with highwaymen and pirates and that sort of thing, because they offer a very good way to launder goods. You can sell tobacco in a pub and no one's really going to ask where it comes from and that sort of thing. So it wasn't the dashing experience it's often depicted as in books and films, and even the life of Turpin himself. In the 18th century, there were more reports of the use of your money or your life, and these robberies were frequent, and if you resisted, often violent. So again, it gets more violent as time goes on. Horace Walpole wrote, "One is forced to travel even at noon as if one is going into battle." And that was even through Hyde Park in London, which is a sort of very open place now and well lit, but I should imagine at the time was quite a huge area where people could just hide and jump out and rob you. Though any road could be picked, it was quite often those radiating out of London. And the worst hit were Hounslow Heath. That was a particular hotspot, but also roads that go south towards the ports were common areas for highwaymen to lurk. Thornton Heath being given the charming name of Hangman's Acre, as it was there was a gallows in that area that was basically set up because of the number of highwaymen. During this late 17th century and early 18th century, highwaymen in Hyde Park were so common that King William III had his the route between St James's Palace and Kensington Palace, which is called Rotten Row, lit at night with oil lamps as a precaution against them. And this makes it the first artificially lit highway in Britain. A little history fact for you there. By the time Turpin was doing his thing, the penalty for robbery with violence was hanging, and most notorious English highwaymen ended up on the gallows. The chief place of execution for London and Middlesex was Tyburn, which is now Marble Arch, and highwaymen who often went to the gallows sort of laughing and joking, or at least showing no fear, and they're said to have been admired by many who came to watch, and it probably added to their romanticism. I think it was the choice of someone who had no other choice and for whom they knew what the consequences were, and they were prepared to live by that. So after about 1815, mounted robbers are recorded rarely. The last recorded robbery by highwaymen is recorded in 1831. This is down to a couple of factors. Repeating handguns, notably the pepper box and the percussion revolver became increasingly available and affordable to the average citizen. So people were more ready to defend themselves. And if you were driving a stagecoach, or if you were taking passengers, or if you were taking the post, you were more likely to be armed. And policing became more widespread. The expansion of systems of turnpikes, manned and gated toll roads, made it basically impossible for them to escape notice and make a getaway. They could easily avoid such systems and use other roads, but cities were flanked by open country, but people wouldn't use those roads because it just became dangerous. So there was no one really left for them to rob. But back to Dick Turpin. So it's believed that he was committed mounted robberies as early as April 1735. But he's cited in an incident on the 10th of July where he's called Turpin the Butcher. He teamed up with Thomas Roden the Pewterer, which is less catchy, and they deprived a man of his belongings in Southwark a few days later. They carried on for the latter part of 1735, but both men carried a bounty of about £100 on their heads, so they kept on the move. They spent time around Barnes, Putney and Hounslow Heath, and then they moved up to Hertfordshire for a bit and then back to London. At one point they're seen near Winchester, but after that they go their separate ways, and Rowden eventually gets caught counterfeiting and is transported in June 1738. Turpin seems to lay low for most of 1736. There's some sightings reported but not confirmed in Holland. In February 1737, he spends the night with his wife, who seems to have stuck by him, in Hertfordshire, and he arranges this meeting by letter. This letter is intercepted by the authorities, and I've put how. I just can't get. Maybe a listener will be able to enlighten me about how the letter is intercepted. I guess someone who knew him, knew who he was, and perhaps intercepted the letter. But anyway, he evades capture by dashing to Cambridge. His wife, her maid, and a man called Robert Knott, who was there with them, they are arrested for being suspected highwaymen, but the two women are freed quite quickly, and after a while so is Knott. So the next couple of months he's involved in various robberies and horse stealing, which results in the capture of two men that he's teamed up with. So he teamed up with a very famous, at the time, highwayman who is a horse thief. And they get caught. They steal a very famous horse that's very recognisable. And they keep this horse as an inn. And because it's so recognisable, the police get notified and they lie in wait. And the man turns up to take the horses. Turpin's there. And the police launch an attack. It's very violent. One of the men gets shot. And some say it's Turpin who fires the shot. This is later found out to be false, but it's enough to send Turpin into hiding in Epping Forest, because obviously at the moment, as far as we know, he's already up for violent robbery, which, as we've seen, is death by hanging, but maybe with a chance of just being deported, whereas murdering someone, not such a good look. But on the 4th of May in Epping Forest, he's seen by Thomas Morris, a servant of one of the forest keepers. So Morris goes off and gets some pistols, and he attempts to apprehend Turpin, who shoots and kills him. So this is reported in the journal, The Gentleman, which now describes Turpin as being about 30, by trade a butcher, about 5'9" high, brown complexion, very much marked with smallpox, his cheekbones broad, his face thinner towards the bottom, his visage short, pretty upright, and broad about the shoulders, and the reward now goes up to £200. So then Dick Turpin disappears. We don't hear from him. And in June 1737, a man named John Palmer travels across the River Humber between Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. He's a horse trader and he hunts with the local hunt and is friends with the gentleman of the local hunt. But on the 2nd of October 1738, Palmer shoots another man's gamecock in the street after a fight. So a man named John Robinson steps in to say that's not quite the done thing, and Palmer then threatens to shoot him as well. Yes, you've guessed it, John Palmer is Dick Turpin. He gets told to pay a fine for the incident by a local magistrate, but flat out refuses, and so is taken to the House of Correction at Beverley in East Riding in Yorkshire. So there's quite a bit, if you're reading up about Dick Turpin, the fact that he could have avoided this, he could have paid the fine, gone home. So some people say that he wanted to be caught and they believe that he was depressed and he wasn't happy with his way of life. It seems sort of weird because he could have avoided all of this, and he's taken to the House of Correction by a really gentle, nice man who escorts him there, and he doesn't try and escape at all, even though he easily could have done. So there he goes. So while he's there, because it's strange that he hasn't just paid this fine, they do some delving into his background and they suspect that he's up to criminal activities. He said he was a butcher and he'd fallen into debt and that he's originally from Lincolnshire. So they check with the town that he says he's from in Lincolnshire, and it's right. He's been living in his previous parish for 9 months, which is why we haven't heard of him. He's been living there as John Palmer. But he's on the lam for suspected sheep stealing. I've just realised that is no pun intended. He's suspected of sheep stealing, which is why he's left Lincolnshire. And he's also suspected of being a horse thief. So the Justice of the Peace from his old parish in Lincolnshire says, please can you detain him? I'm coming over. So he's now deemed too much of a big deal to be kept in the House of Correction and refuses the request for sureties, which means he refuses to put up money. It's a sort of like a reverse bail, basically. He puts up money to promise that he's going to be a good boy. So he's taken to York Castle, which is proper prison. So sheep theft is one thing. Horse theft is much more serious, and in 1587 it had been made a capital offence punishable by death. So, in fact, all robbery is taken really seriously at the time, and violent robbery is seen as second to murder. So Turpin's not been that careful in covering his tracks. He's stolen several horses while operating under the pseudonym of John Palmer. And in July 1737, he stole a horse from Pinchbeck in Lincolnshire, taking it to visit his father in Hampstead. When Turpin returns to Yorkshire, stealing 3 horses on the way, he leaves the original stolen gelding with his father. So the identity of John Turpin's son is well known. It's not a particularly common name as it is. So the horse's identity is soon discovered. You know, John Turpin's son's visited and he's suddenly got a new horse. So on the 12th of September 1738, John Turpin is committed to jail in Essex on charges of horse theft, but following his help in preventing a jailbreak, these charges are dropped on the 5th of March 1739. About a month later, Palmer had been moved to York Castle, and then Thomas Creasy, the owner of the 3 horses stolen by Turpin, manages to track them down and recover them. And so Turpin is then, or John Palmer, is then tried for these thefts. So while in prison, Turpin writes to his brother-in-law, who also lives in Hampstead, but the letter gets kept at the local post office, because when the brother-in-law sees the York post stamp, he refuses to pay the delivery charge. He says he has no correspondent at York. He probably wanted to distance himself from Turpin's affairs. And so the letters moved to the post office at Saffron Walden. And then, weirdly, James Smith, who had taught his younger schoolmate, Dick Turpin, how to write when they were at school, recognised the handwriting. So he alerts JP Thomas Stubbing, who pays the postage, opens the letter, and then travels to York Castle with James Smith, the school friend, and on the 23rd of February identifies Palmer as Turpin. And Smith actually receives the £200, which is about 32,000 in today's money, as the reward originally offered by the Duke of Newcastle, who put the reward up when his keeper, Thomas Morris, had been shot by Turpin in Epping Forest. So everything ramps up a bit after this. The Duke of Newcastle wants Turpin tried in London, not in York, but he did actually stay in York and was tried for horse theft. Turpin himself wanted to be taken to Essex because he believed he should be tried in his hometown. But as he's associated with the Essex gang, it doesn't seem particularly safe for him to go to Essex anyway. So it all gets a bit complicated. The charges are technically invalid as they get the date wrong. If this happened now, it would be an invalid accusation. But at the time, those who stood accused were not entitled to legal representation. So you can represent yourself, and Turpin did, but he didn't do it that well. So he complained that he hadn't been given enough time to call his own witnesses and he should be being tried in Essex, but they don't really care. They say you knew that when this was coming and you had as much time as anyone else. And he said, well, I can't get witnesses if I'm not in Essex. It sort of seems a bit not what you would think the romantic highwayman of the stories would be doing. So the jury finds him guilty. They don't even have to leave the room. And he's sentenced to death, despite making lame excuses that he wasn't prepared for the case and he'd be told he was going to be tried in Essex and not York. He's sentenced to death. The judge asks him, is there any reason why you shouldn't be sentenced to death? And he literally just goes, oh, well, I thought I was going to be in Essex. Or I didn't realise I was going to be tried now, so I'm not prepared. So he seems to have sort of come into his own rather while in prison, waiting for his sentence to be carried out. And at the time, those visits to those awaiting execution is at the jailer's discretion. And Turpin's jailer apparently made £100 for selling drinks to Turpin and his friends. He refused any offer of help from a clergyman. He ignored his father's request to seek a pardon from God before his death. The day before his death, he bought a new frock coat and shoes and paid 5 mourners. And on the 7th of April 1739, followed by his mourners, Turpin and John Stead, who's another horse thief, were taken through York by open cart to Knavesmere, which is the city's equivalent of Tyburn gallows, and Turpin apparently behaved himself with amazing assurance and bowed to the spectators as he passed. He climbed the ladder to the gallows. He spoke to the executioner, which this is... So York had no permanent hangman. There was a custom that you could pardon a prisoner on condition that he acted as executioner. So on the occasion of Turpin's execution, the pardoned man was a fellow highwayman, Thomas Hadfield. Turpin behaved in an undaunted manner. He mounted the ladder, spoke a few words to the topsman. This is all coming from the Gentleman magazine on the 7th of April 1939, and threw himself off and expired in 5 minutes. So he goes up undaunted. The method for hanging at the time is known as the short drop method, and it means that rather than a nice neck snap for those being executed, it's a slow strangulation, which is awful. So he's left hanging there until late afternoon, and then he's cut down, taken to a tavern in Castlegate, and then the next morning his body is buried at St George's Church. Then on the Tuesday following the burial, the corpse was reportedly stolen by body snatchers. So the theft of cadavers for medical research was common enough and tolerated by the authorities in York, but it was unpopular with the general public, understandably. And the body snatchers and Turpin's corpse were soon apprehended by a mob. The bodies recovered and reburied, supposedly this time with quicklime to aid decomposition. and it's now supposedly lying in St George's graveyard, although doubt remains about the grave's authenticity. I think it's interesting that he ends up in York, where he basically only spent, as far as we know, a year or so. But I wonder if he had been in London, if he would have suffered the fate of having his body hung for people to see for months, which is what happened to other members of the gang. So after his death, books and papers immediately started being written about him. So if you think about modern media, as soon as something happens, it's on Twitter, it's on the Mail Online, that everything updates immediately. Obviously, the printing press and everything was slower back then, but they still had that desire to sort of ride the wave and take advantage of anything that they think is going to sell or make any money. So firstly, there's The Genuine History of the Life of Richard Turpin by Richard Bays. And unlike the name suggests, it's only about half fact, and the other half is complete fiction designed to appeal to people while the news is still hot. In the novel Rookwood, which is published in 1834, we're introduced to the magnificent Black Bess, Turpin's fictional horse, who manages to outrun their pursuers from York to London and dies from the effort at the end, which I remember psychologically damaging. I was desperate to have Black Bess when I was younger. Turns out, no such thing. He literally, as far as we can tell, would steal a horse, ride it, leave it somewhere, get another horse, sell it. And though it is rumoured that another highwayman, who I might do an episode on, did do the ride from York to London. So this is where really, it's in this book, Rookwood, where Turpin goes from being this short, pockmarked, violent horse thief to this knight of the road and rather dashing, likeable rogue. So even today, he does wonders for local tourism. The town of Hinckley is very pleased that he lived there with his parents and his horse, Black Bess. He even haunts some of the areas of town, but there's no actual evidence historically that he was there at all. And as we know, Black Bess never existed. He may have stopped off at Hinckley on his way to and from York in Lincolnshire, but there's no mention of him living there. We know his parents stayed in Essex for the entire time. So the thing we do have is in the National Archive, there's the indictment for John Palmer showing that he was charged with stealing a black mare worth £3, a filly foal worth 20 shillings from Thomas Creasy at Welton, Yorkshire on the 1st of March 1739, which is a month or so before he's hanged. And that is the story of Dick Turpin, one of possibly the UK's most famous highwaymen, who is not the gallant, dashing rogue that we've been led to believe, but a rather small, violent man with no lovely pony to make him more palatable. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. It's a little bit less horrendous than last week's. As always, I really love to have listener suggestions. So if you have a topic you'd like me to cover, let me know. So if you would like to send us an email, it's themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can find us on social media at The Monday Night Review on Facebook and Instagram, where you can also buy us a coffee. So thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week. And until then, stay safe, be kind, and always check the back seat before you drive.